Hi everyone, and welcome back to our course on drugs and criminal justice policy. This week we're shifting our focus from how drug laws are written and categorized to how these laws are actually enforced on the ground. The question we're asking this week is simple, but the answer, I'm afraid, is not. Are drug laws enforced fairly? Or does enforcement reflect deeper patterns of discretion, inequality, and visibility? Over the next two lectures, we'll explore who gets arrested, why, and what drugs can and cannot tell us about drug crimes in the U.S. Today's focus on reading between the stats. We are going to look specifically at how data on drug use and drug arrests don't always align, and why that specifically matters. We'll examine disparities between drug use and arrest rates across demographic groups, why data can mislead if we don't understand enforcement patterns, and how numbers, especially arrest stats, can obscure more than they reveal. Let's dig in and start reading between the lines. Let's begin with a simple question. If two groups use drugs at the same rate, would you expect them to be arrested at the same rate? You probably would, but in the United States, that assumption simply doesn't hold. Data from the National Health Survey show us that white and black Americans use drugs at nearly identical rates. But when we look at their arrest data, we can see that black Americans are arrested for drug offenses at roughly 3 times the rate of white Americans. That's not a statistical fluke. It's a structural problem. And if black Americans aren't using drugs at such a high level, and that indicates that something else is going on. It's because policing and enforcement are shaped by factors beyond behavior, meaning factors like geography, visibility, and historical bias. So today we're going to unpack how and why those numbers divulge. In other words, the numbers don't tell a neutral story. They tell a story about who gets watched and who gets punished. So let's start with the core disconnect here. Drug use is widespread and largely consistent across racial groups. National surveys like the National Survey of Drug Use and Health show that white Americans consistently report slightly higher or equivalent levels of drug use to black and Hispanic Americans. Yet black Americans are dramatically overrepresented in drug arrests, convictions, and incarceration. This isn't because they are using more drugs or committing more crime. It's because they are more likely to be policed, more likely to be arrested, and more likely to be charged harshly. We have to understand that arrest data is not a mirror of behavior. It's a mirror of enforcement decisions. Now let's look at another factor, how we define and charge drug crimes. The line between possession and intent to distribute is very thin and highly subjective. Two people could be carrying the same amount of a controlled substance. One might be charged with simple possession, the other with a felony intent to distribute charge based on packaging, location, or officer discretion. And then there are enhanced zones, like drug-free school zones, that trigger mandatory penalties. These zones are often drawn broadly, especially in urban centers where overlapping zones can cover entire neighborhoods. That means residents in some areas face higher penalties by default, regardless of behavior. In other words, the geography of enforcement shapes the severity of outcomes. It's not always about what someone did, it's about where they did it and how the system chooses to interpret it. And now let's look at the numbers themselves. Arrest data is often treated as objective in nature, but it is anything but. Let's consider 3 forms of bias to start. 1 is sampling bias. Police do not patrol all areas equally. They focus on neighborhoods that are already heavily policed, often based on prior arrest records. This creates a feedback loop of sorts. More patrols means more stops. More stops means more arrest. Arrest means more justification for patrols, and the cycle continues. 2, we often see reporting bias. Crimes in certain communities may never be reported, while others are hyper-visible. For instance, drug use behind closed doors in suburban homes may go unnoticed, but public use in a park draws immediate attention. 3, we also see systemic bias. Structural incentives can nudge law enforcement towards arrest-heavy strategies. Federal funding for task forces, local arrest quotas, and political pressure to do something about drugs all can influence enforcement behavior. So when we look at arrest data, we're not seeing where crime happens. We're seeing where law enforcement is choosing to look. And this brings us to a larger point. The data itself isn't neutral, it's political. Because who collects the crime data? Often it's law enforcement agencies. What gets counted? What gets ignored? These are decisions with real consequences. Take, for example, the transition from the FBI's Uniform Crime Reporting, UCR, program to the more detailed National Incident-Based Reporting System, or NIBRS. This shift was intended to offer better transparency, but participation is voluntary and many agencies don't fully report every year. Or let's consider how rarely racial and ethnic data are broken down beyond basic categories. Without fine-grained detail, we obscure important differences between, say, Latino, Indigenous, and Asian communities. In short, who controls the data controls the narrative. Here's a concrete example. In 2013, the ACLU published a report titled "The War on Marijuana in Black and White." It shows that despite nearly equal usage rates, Black people were nearly 4 times as likely to be arrested for marijuana possession nationwide. In some counties, it was 10 times as likely. Again, it's not because Black Americans smoke more marijuana than white Americans, especially now that many states have legalized in some way. But what does that tell us? It tells us that drug laws are not enforced the same. Not based on behavior, but based on who is visible, who is targeted, and who lacks the power to push back. For those living in the suburbs or even in gated communities, you know that they're still smoking. They're just not doing it in a visible or detectable way. Patrols are lessened, there's less visibility overall. But in the middle of a low-income, high-enforcement area, you know you're going to get picked up. This is what it means for data to obscure injustice. On the surface, the system appears fair, but underneath the numbers tell a very different story, if we know how to read them. So let's recap. Today we've challenged the idea that crime statistics are objective reflections of behavior. Instead, we've seen that arrest data reflects enforcement patterns, not actual drug use. Definitions of drug crime are often considered fluid and shaped by geography and discretion. Bias in data collection, sampling, and reporting distorts our picture of justice. And ultimately, data can be used to reinforce harmful narratives if we fail to interrogate it. In our next lecture, we're going to explore the policing practices behind those numbers, because if the stats aren't neutral, neither is the enforcement behind them. Thanks everyone for your time and attention today, and I'll see you next time.